Princess Caliph stood at the observation window of the imperial palace and watched the three suns of her homeworld sink below the crystal mountains in the distance. She was 12 cycles old by galactic standard, and she had already learned that her mother was dying, not in the way humans died with their brief flicker of life, burning out in mere decades, but in the slow, terrible way that immortals died when they simply stopped caring about living. Empress Lasara Velkith ruled 10,000 worlds across 17 star systems, and she had done so alone for 47 cycles since the death of her consort in the Border Wars. Caliph remembered her father only in fragments because she had been so young when he fell, but she remembered her mother before the loneliness had hollowed her out, and that memory hurt more than anything else. The Valesian Empire was ancient beyond human understanding, and its people had walked among the stars when Earth was still covered in ice and primitive mammals, and they had built wonders that other species could barely comprehend. But they were tired now. The great halls of the palace that had once rung with music and debate now stood silent, and the birth rates had fallen so low that each new child was celebrated across entire star systems, and the warriors who had once defended the empire with fierce pride now spent their days in philosophical contemplation of endings. Caliph had studied the other species of the galaxy in her lessons, and she had found most of them disappointing in various ways. The Kreth were strong, but they thought only of conquest and domination, and the Veloci were wise, but they had retreated so far into their contemplations that they barely interacted with the physical world anymore, and the consortium species were cunning, but their cunning served only greed and short-term gain. And then there were the humans. Caliph had first encountered human culture through intercepted entertainment transmissions, because her tutors considered humanity too young and too crude for serious study. But Caliph was curious, and curiosity was rare enough among young Valesians that the palace information systems had been instructed to indulge it. What she found confused her at first. These creatures lived barely a century, and yet they packed more living into those brief years than most Valesians managed in a millennium, and they fought and loved and failed and tried again with a desperate energy that seemed almost obscene to her ancient sensibilities. She watched their historical records and saw them crawling out of caves to build cities, and then watching those cities burn and then building them again bigger and more beautiful than before. She watched them face extinction events and plagues and wars that killed millions, and somehow they just kept going forward. Always forward, never accepting that something was impossible, simply because it had never been done. The human ambassadors had arrived at the Galactic Council 3 decades ago, and the elder races had laughed at them. These mayflies thought they could sit among the immortals and contribute to galactic governance when their leaders would be dead before the next council session even concluded. But the humans had not gone away. They had argued and negotiated and made themselves useful in 1,000 small ways, and now they held trading rights in 40 systems, and their ships patrolled the border regions that the elder races found too tedious to manage, and their population had exploded across 12 colony worlds while the Valesians struggled to maintain their numbers. Caliph had made a decision. She had spent 6 months researching the proper protocols for interspecies diplomatic communication, and she had drafted her message 17 times before she was satisfied, and she had used her imperial access codes to send it directly to the human diplomatic corps on Earth, without anyone in her mother's court knowing what she had done. The message read as follows: Human representatives, I am Princess Caliph of the Valesian Empire, and I am writing to you with a request that may seem unusual, but I ask that you consider it seriously. My mother, the Empress Lasara Velkith, has ruled our empire alone for nearly 50 cycles since the death of my father, and the burden of governance has worn her down in ways that frighten me. She requires a partner of exceptional quality to share in the responsibilities of rule, and I require a father to help guide me as I prepare for my own future duties. Your species has demonstrated remarkable qualities that I believe would complement Volition governance, including adaptability and resilience and creative problem solving and an unwillingness to accept defeat. I formally request that a suitable human candidate present themselves for consideration as a potential consort to the Empress. The future of 10,000 worlds may depend upon your answer. I await your response with hope. Princess Calith Velkith. She had signed it with her official seal and sent it before she could lose her nerve, and then she had waited. On Earth, the message arrived in the middle of the night at the Diplomatic Corps headquarters in Geneva, and the duty officer who received it stared at his screen for a full minute before he believed what he was reading. By morning, the message had been verified and authenticated 17 times, and it had climbed the chain of command all the way to the Human Council itself, and the council chambers had erupted into the most chaotic debate in decades. Some representatives argued that this was obviously a trap or a test designed to humiliate humanity on the galactic stage, and others insisted it was a genuine opportunity that could not be ignored, and still others worried about the implications of a human actually marrying into alien royalty. The media got hold of the story within hours, and suddenly every human with access to a screen was discussing the little alien princess who wanted a stepfather for herself and a husband for her immoral mother. Jokes were made and memes were created, and the whole thing threatened to become a circus of exactly the kind that would offend Volition sensibilities and doom any chance of a positive outcome. But somewhere in the chaos, a few people actually read the message carefully and understood what the child was really asking. She was asking for help. She was watching her mother fade away and her civilization decline, and she had reached out to the one species in the galaxy that seemed to specialize in refusing to accept inevitable defeat. She was asking humanity to do what humanity did best. She was asking them to try. Commander Marcus Cole was 3 weeks into a routine patrol of the outer asteroid belt when the priority transmission arrived from Earth Command and informed him that his life was about to become very complicated. He was 43 years old, with gray starting to show at his temples and scars on his hands from 20 years of military service, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had been lived in hard. He had been married twice, and both marriages had ended poorly because he was better at solving interstellar crises than he was at remembering anniversaries, and he had made peace with the idea that he would probably spend the rest of his career commanding patrol frigates in the quiet corners of human space. The transmission from command ordered him to report to Geneva immediately for a diplomatic assignment of the highest priority, and when he asked for more details, the response was simply that the council would explain everything when he arrived. Marcus did not like surprises, and he liked political assignments even less, but he was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. The journey to Earth took 11 days and gave him plenty of time to wonder what he had done to deserve whatever was coming when he arrived. At the Diplomatic Corps headquarters, he was escorted to a conference room where 7 members of the Human Council sat waiting for him with expressions that ranged from amused to deeply concerned. They explained the situation. An alien princess had sent a formal request asking for a human to marry her mother, the Empress of the largest and oldest empire in the known galaxy, and the council had decided that Marcus Cole was the best candidate to send as humanity's representative. Marcus stared at them for a long moment, and then he laughed. He assumed it was a joke, but the council members did not laugh with him, and slowly the reality of what they were saying began to sink. And they showed him the princess's message and explained that they had spent weeks analyzing potential candidates, and that his name had risen to the top of every list for reasons they proceeded to outline in exhausting detail. He had negotiated peace with the Kreth Raiders when everyone said it was impossible, and he had saved 2 colony ships during the Proxima Uprising through tactics that the military academies still studied, and he had a reputation for creative problem-solving and stubborn integrity that made him uniquely suited for a mission this. Delicate Marcus listened to all of this, and then he asked the only question that mattered to him. What does this kid actually want? The council members exchanged glances and admitted that they were not entirely sure, but that the princess seemed genuinely concerned about her mother and the state of their empire. Marcus read the message again more carefully this time. He saw a 12-year-old girl watching her mother suffer under an impossible burden, and he saw a child who had been brave enough to reach out to strangers for help, and he saw someone who deserved a real answer, not a political calculation. This is ridiculous, he said finally. That poor kid just wants her mother to be happy, and someone should actually help instead of treating this like a political circus. The council took this as acceptance of the mission. The journey to Elysian space took 3 months aboard a diplomatic vessel, and Marcus spent most of that time studying everything humanity knew about the empire he was about to enter. He learned their language and their customs and their history, and he read everything he could find about Empress Lazara and her deceased consort and their daughter, the princess who had started all of this. He also reviewed the files on the other candidates who had been considered and rejected, and he was surprised to find that most of them had been eliminated because they showed too much interest in the power and prestige that would come with the position. The council had specifically chosen him because he did not want the job. When the diplomatic vessel entered Elysian space, it was met by an escort of Imperial warships that dwarfed the human craft in size and elegance, and Marcus felt for the first time the true scale of what he was walking into. The Elysian homeworld was beautiful in a way that made Earth seem rough and unfinished, and the Imperial palace rose from the landscape like something out of a dream. All crystal spires and floating gardens and architecture that seemed to defy physics itself. Marcus was escorted through corridors that could have held entire city blocks and past artwork that predated human civilization by millions of years, and he felt very small and very mortal in a way he had not felt since his first day of basic training. The throne room was the size of a stadium, and Empress Lazara sat at its center on a throne carved from a single massive crystal, and she looked exactly like the images he had studied, except that the images had not captured the weight of exhaustion in her eyes. She was beautiful in the way that stars were beautiful, distant and ancient, and burning with a light that seemed somehow dim. Princess Keleth stood beside her mother, and she watched Marcus approach with an intensity that reminded him of a scientist studying a specimen. He stopped at the proper distance and performed the bow he had practiced 100 times, and he waited for the Empress to speak. She studied him in silence for a long moment, and then she asked why he had come. Marcus had prepared several diplomatic responses to this question, but when the moment arrived, he found that he could not bring himself to use any of them. Your daughter wrote a letter asking for help, he said simply. Where I come from, you do not ignore a kid asking for help. The Empress's expression did not change, but Keleth smiled very slightly, and Marcus had the feeling that he had just passed a test he had not known he was taking. The first month of Marcus Cole's presence in the Imperial Palace was governed by protocols that dated back millions of years and made absolutely no sense to anyone except the ancient bureaucrats who enforced them. He was required to present himself at court each morning at precisely the 7th hour, and to remain standing in formal observation of the Empress for 3 hours. Before being dismissed without having exchanged a single word, he was given quarters appropriate to a diplomatic guest, which meant rooms larger than most human houses filled with furniture he could not identify and technology he was afraid to touch. He was assigned 17 attendants, whose job was apparently to watch him at all times and report everything he did to various factions within the court, who were either hoping he would fail spectacularly or succeed unexpectedly, depending on their political positions. Marcus endured all of this for exactly 32 days before his patience ran out. On the 33rd morning, he did not report to the throne room at the 7th hour. and instead, he walked directly to the private gardens where the Empress took her morning meal alone, and he sat down across from her without invitation. The attendants who had followed him were horrified, and the guards who protected the Empress moved forward with weapons drawn, but Lasara raised one hand, and everyone froze. "You're not supposed to be here," she said. "I know," Marcus replied, "but these protocols of yours seem designed to prevent us from ever actually talking to each other, and I did not travel 3 months through space to stand around being useless." Lazara studied him with those ancient tired eyes, and for a moment, Marcus was certain he had destroyed whatever chance this mission had ever had. But then something shifted in her expression, and she gestured for him to stay. The attendants were dismissed, and the guards withdrew to a respectful distance, and for the first time since he had arrived, Marcus found himself alone with the Empress of 10,000 Worlds. She asked him what he wanted to talk about. Everything he said, and nothing. And whatever you actually want to say, instead of whatever the protocols tell you that you should say. Lasara was silent for a long moment, and then she laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but genuine, and Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. They talked for 4 hours that first morning. She asked him about Earth and humanity, and what it felt like to live a life measured in decades instead of millennia, and he told her about growing up in the American Southwest and joining the military, because he did not know what else to do with himself, and the marriages that had failed and the battles that had scarred him. She told him about her consort, who had died in a war that seemed pointless in retrospect, and about the loneliness that had followed, and about watching her civilization slowly lose its will to continue. She told him about Keleth, and how the child was the only thing that still made her feel like the future mattered. Marcus listened more than he spoke, because he understood that she had not had anyone to really listen to her in a very long time. The courtship continued from there, but it was nothing like what the protocols had intended. Marcus refused to participate in the formal ceremonies, and instead he invited the Empress to walk with him through the palace gardens or to share meals in the smaller private dining rooms, or simply to sit and talk about whatever came to mind. The court was scandalized. Ancient traditions were being ignored, and foreign customs were being introduced, and worst of all, the Empress seemed to be enjoying herself in a way that many courtiers had never witnessed. Keleth watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. She had researched this human carefully, and she had chosen well. Marcus did not seem intimidated by her mother's power, and he did not seem interested in gaining power for himself, and he treated the Empress not as an immortal ruler, but as a person who had been carrying too heavy a burden for too long. He also spent time with Keleth herself. He taught her human games of strategy that were simpler than Velision games, but had their own elegant logic, and she beat him easily at first, until he began studying the patterns of her play and learning to counter them. She found that she enjoyed having someone who would actually challenge her instead of letting her win out of deference to her position. 3 months passed, and the relationship between Marcus and Lasara deepened in ways that surprised them both. But the galaxy was watching. The consortium of the Outer Dark had long coveted Velision territory, and they saw what was happening in the Imperial Palace as a sign of weakness. An aging empress distracted by an alien suitor, and a child princess playing games, instead of preparing for rule, and an empire grown so soft that it would invite primitives into its highest halls. The consortium began to gather its fleets. Far from the crystal spires of the palace, war was coming, and the empire that had stood for millions of years would soon face its greatest test, and everything would depend on whether a human soldier could find a way to do the impossible one more time. Marcus was in his quarters reviewing trade agreements when the emergency lighting activated, and the calm voice of the palace defense system announced that hostile vessels had been detected emerging from dark space in the core systems. He was dressed and moving within seconds, because 20 years of military service had trained him to respond to alarms. Before his conscious mind fully understood what was happening, The war room was chaos when Aravid Velasian admirals stood around a massive holographic display showing the disposition of forces, and their elegant faces showed something that Marcus had never seen in them before. Fear. The consortium fleet had emerged from dark space in 3 separate locations simultaneously, and they had brought more than 300 warships against the Imperial Navy's diminished forces. The Velasian fleet had barely 80 combat-capable vessels, and many of those were ancient ships, crewed by officers who had not seen real battle in centuries. The Empress entered the war room with Caliph beside her, and the admirals fell silent awaiting her command. The senior admiral stepped forward and delivered his assessment in the calm, measured tones of someone who had already accepted defeat. The enemy outnumbered them nearly 4-1, and their fleet was fresh and battle-ready, while the Imperial Navy was scattered and unprepared. And the most logical course of action was to negotiate terms of surrender before the destruction became total. Terms would be harsh, the Empress would abdicate, and the human would be executed as a symbol of imperial weakness, and Velasian space would be administered by the consortium pending reorganization. Reese listened to this assessment with a face of stone, and Marcus could see the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her shoulders. She had spent her entire reign trying to protect her people, and now she was being asked to choose between certain defeat and humiliating surrender. Marcus stepped forward. "Give me command of the defense," he said. The war room went silent. Admirals stared at him with expressions ranging from shock to outrage, and several of them began speaking at once, pointing out that he had no authority and no standing, and no right to involve himself in Velasian military matters. But Caliph's voice cut through the noise. "Give it to him," she said, and everyone turned to look at the young princess who had started all of this. "I researched him thoroughly," she continued. "And this is what humans." Dolasara looked at her daughter, and then at Marcus, and then at the holographic display showing the overwhelming enemy force, and she made her decision. "The human is command," she said, and her voice carried the full weight of imperial authority. The admirals were horrified, but they obeyed. Marcus took his position at the central display and began issuing orders, and what followed over the next 17 hours became legendary across the galaxy. He did not fight the way Velasians fought. Velasian warfare was elegant and formal, with clearly defined rules of engagement and honorable exchanges between opposing forces, and it was beautiful in its own way, but it was designed for an era when the Empire was strong and could afford the luxury of fighting fairly. Marcus fought like a human. He ordered the Imperial merchant fleet to scatter throughout the system, broadcasting false military signatures, and suddenly the consortium admirals could not tell which contacts were warships and which were freighters. He positioned his actual combat vessels in the asteroid fields and debris zones where their energy signatures would be masked and where the larger consortium ships would be at a disadvantage. Had the communications officers broadcast a continuous stream of encrypted messages suggesting that a massive human reinforcement fleet was en route from Earth, and that the consortium had made a terrible mistake by attacking when they did. The consortium commanders hesitated because they had not anticipated resistance, and they had not expected the Imperials to fight dirty, and the false intelligence about human reinforcements made them uncertain about how far they could push. Marcus used that hesitation. He led a strike team personally aboard a fast attack craft, and he targeted the consortium flagship directly, and the admirals told him this was suicide because the flagship was defended by dozens of escort vessels. He went anyway. The attack craft slipped through the chaos of battle using the debris from destroyed ships as cover, and Marcus had studied the flagship's design during the journey to Velasian space because he studied everything, and he knew there was a weakness in the navigation array that could be exploited. His team breached the flagship's outer hull and fought their way to the navigation systems, and they planted charges that would disable the ship's ability to coordinate. Fleet Movement's Marcus took a piece of shrapnel in his side during the extraction, but he refused to acknowledge the wound because there was no time when the charges detonated the consortium. Flagship went dark and the fleet coordination collapsed, and suddenly 300 warships were operating without central command. Imperial Navy attacked the ancient Velisian warships that had not seen real combat in centuries, came alive with a fury that no one had expected, and the officers, who had grown philosophical about endings, discovered that they still remembered how to fight. 3 hours later, the first human ships arrived. They were just 3 fast cruisers that had pushed their engines beyond safe limits to respond to the distress call. But the consortium did not know how many more were coming, and the false intelligence that Marcus had spread suddenly seemed very real. The consortium retreated 17 hours after the battle began. The core systems were secure, and the greatest military threat the Empire had faced in centuries had been broken. Marcus was carried to the medical bay because he had finally collapsed from blood loss, and the doctors were amazed that he had remained standing as long as he had with a wound that should have killed him hours ago. Princess Keleth found him there. She stood beside his bed and looked at the human who had done the impossible, and she said the only thing that seemed appropriate. "You are acceptable," she told him, and her translator struggled with the emotion in her voice. For a human, the wedding of Empress Lysara Velketh and Marcus Cole of Earth was the largest diplomatic event in recorded galactic history. 12 species sent representatives, and the ceremony was broadcast across 17 star systems, and trillions of beings watched as 2 civilizations joined together in a way that no one had ever imagined possible. The preparations had taken 6 months because Velisian tradition required certain rituals to be observed, and human tradition required certain other rituals. And combining the two without offending anyone had been a diplomatic challenge worthy of its own historical chapter. Marcus had insisted on only one thing: he wanted to write his own vows. This caused considerable confusion among the Velisian ceremonial planners because Velisian weddings involved ancient formulas that had been perfected over millions of years, and the idea of improvising something as important as marriage vows seemed almost sacrilegious. But Lysara had supported him, and when the Empress supported something, it happened. The ceremony took place in the Grand Pavilion of the Imperial Palace, which had been designed specifically for occasions of cosmic significance, and it had not been used in over 1,000 years. Princess Keleth served as the officiant because Velisian tradition held that the heir should bless the union of the ruler, and she wore formal robes that made her look older than her 13 cycles. Marcus stood before her in a uniform that combined elements of human military dress with Velisian diplomatic regalia, and he looked uncomfortable in the way that soldiers always look uncomfortable in formal clothing. Lysara stood across from him in a gown woven from crystallized starlight, and she looked more alive than anyone had seen her in decades. The ceremony proceeded through the required Velisian rituals, and then it was time for the human portion, and Marcus stepped forward to speak. He had written his vows 17 times and discarded each version because none of them seemed right, and in the end he had decided to simply say what he actually meant. "I did not come here looking for power," he began, and his voice carried across the vast pavilion. "I came because a brave young girl asked for help, and where I come from, you do not ignore that kind of courage." He looked at Lysara, and his expression softened. "I have fought battles that should have killed me, and I have failed at things that mattered, and I have spent most of my life alone because I did not know how to be anything else. But these past months have shown me something I did not expect. They have shown me that 2 people from different worlds with different lives and different ways of seeing the universe can still find something real together." He paused and took a breath. "I cannot promise to be a perfect consort or a wise ruler or anything that your traditions expect. But I can promise to stand beside you when things get hard, and to tell you the truth even when you do not want to hear it, and to keep trying, even when everything seems impossible. That is what humans do. We keep trying, Lazar's composure had held through the entire ceremony, but something cracked when Marcus finished speaking and for the first time in over a century, the Empress of 10,000 Worlds wept in public. Caliph completed the ceremony with the formal words that bound them together, and then she added something that was not in the script. I am pleased to report that my petition has been resolved satisfactorily, she said, and her voice carried the same mix of formality and humor that Marcus had come to associate with her. Thank you all for attending. The celebration that followed lasted for days, and the effects of the Union rippled outward across the galaxy. For years, human advisors began appearing in Volition governance councils, not replacing the ancient traditions, but challenging them in ways that forced the immortals to remember why they had built their civilization in the first place. The Volition birth rate began to rise for the first time in centuries, and scholars debated whether this was due to medical advances or simply to a renewed sense of hope for the future. The consortium of the Outer Dark fragmented into competing factions that spent more time fighting each other than threatening imperial space, and other species began to look at humanity differently. These short-lived creatures had somehow married into the most ancient empire in the galaxy, and instead of being absorbed by Volition culture, they had begun to transform it. They brought energy and creativity and an irritating refusal to accept that anything was impossible simply because it had never been done. They brought life to a civilization that had been slowly dying without realizing it. Marcus Cole never fully adjusted to being called Prince Consort of 10,000 Worlds. He still preferred the bridge of a patrol ship to the halls of the palace, and he still argued with admirals who thought they knew better than he did, and he still played strategy games with Caliph and lost more often than he won. But every evening he sat with Lysara in their private quarters, and they talked about everything and nothing, and the weight that had been crushing her for so long grew lighter with each passing day. Caliph watched them from the doorway sometimes, and she remembered the night she had sent that message to Earth. She had asked for a partner for a mother and a father for herself, and she had received both. But she had received something else too. She had received proof that the universe was not finished surprising her, that hope could come from the most unexpected places, that the future was not something to fear, but something to build, and that humans with their brief lives and their stubborn hearts and their absolute refusal to accept defeat might just be exactly what the galaxy had needed all along. She smiled and turned away, and left her parents to their conversation. There was work to be done, an empire to govern, a future to create, and she had learned from the best how to face impossible challenges. You simply refused to believe they were impossible, and then you tried anyway.